Hey everybody, welcome back to our next technical tutorial. Today we're going to learn how to use various types of line in digital mediums. So what we're going to learn is Adobe Photoshop CC 2018 and Adobe Illustrator CC 2018, and we're going to learn how to draw various types of line. Line is really important in video game design because it can really define your environment, your character, and really help contrast between the two of those things. And before we get started, let me talk to you a little bit about the equipment I'm using. I'm on my Intuos tablet, so I'm using a Wacom Intuos tablet here, and I believe mine is the Intuos 4. But you can see you can get a really large variety of tablets depending on your budget. All of these are really good products, and you can go really fancy and have it where you actually see your tablet on the screen, or you can go a little on the cheaper end where it's around $75. This is a really good investment if you're a budding game artist, especially if you want to do 2D game design. For sure, invest in one of these tablets. And if you want to go into the digital sculpting world and to kind of use ZBrush and other programs like this. Most of these tablets are pressure sensitive, meaning the harder I push down, the more functions I get. Now you can use a regular old mouse for this tutorial. It will work the same, but some of the cool pressure sensitivity functions will not work with your mouse, being that you just have an on and off click. So there's all sorts of different types of brands. Wacom is not the only one, but if you're interested or you're looking for a present that somebody wants to buy you, definitely look to invest in one of these tablets early on. It will definitely speed up your workflow as you move forward. And don't be afraid to even invest in an older version. They update quite frequently, and I know it's cool to have the best new thing, but a lot of my tablets I've had for years, and they work splendidly well for what I need them for. All right, so let's get started. I want you to go ahead, and we're going to start in Adobe Photoshop, and we're going to draw some raster lines. And remember, raster are pixel-based lines. Therefore, they cannot be scaled without some sort of quality or resolution loss. So we're going to start in Photoshop by opening a new document. And let's go ahead and open a new file. So File, New. And let's kind of stick with a quick square preset. So we're going to go ahead and use our recent presets. For those of you from the last tutorial may remember, we went to Art and Illustration, and we chose the 1000 by 1000 pixel grid, and we changed our resolution to 72 dpi. This will be present in the recent category if you're using the same computer. If not, just simply go ahead and type those values in. So let's go ahead and hit create and get our canvas. And just like anything when we're working, we want to work on new layers. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer at the bottom of my kind of layer stack here. And I'm going to hit B for brush. Now, if I hold down my key or my mouse click, you'll see I have a lot of different options. I have the brush tool, the pencil tool, the color replacement tool, and the mixer brush tool, all of which are B for a shortcut. And you'll remember in previous tutorials, if we hold the shift key, we can actually cycle through, by tapping the B key, we can cycle through these other tools. I primarily use the brush tool and the mixer brush. We'll get to the mixer brush a little later, but let's start with the brush tool itself. So when we use the brush tool, we can kind of look at the top kind of toolbar to see some of our settings. For instance, we have the little drop down here kind of controls the type of brush we're using. We have a brush preset manager that really allows us to edit and rotate and play with the brush setting itself. We have the blending mode of the brush, which means we can kind of layer and overlap different colors and things like that. Opacity of the brush. The flow, so how much brush versus, think airbrushing here, brush versus air is coming out. So we'll turn that up to 100%. And then you can see we have various other buttons. Now these other buttons are really, really nice, one of which is smoothing, and smoothing will actually reduce the shakiness of your stroke. So if I go ahead and hit 75%, and let me just draw a stroke, we'll make sure we're on a black color here, and just draw, I can have a pretty shaky hand and still get a pretty decent amount of stroke. And I'm just hitting Control-Alt-Z to go back, or if you're kind of old school, you can go up here and use your step backwards, step forward. So we'll go ahead and put that back down to 0. You can see I have a lot more shakiness in my brush. The other options that are really neat are obviously our smoothing options, but we also have things that will kind of deal with our pressure sensitivity. So we have an airbrush mode, we have a pen pressure mode, which is really nice. So this will actually help with the opacity. And then like I mentioned before, if we kind of go down to the very end here, we have more that deal with the actual opacity of our brush. So we can turn on these things, and the lighter I draw my stroke, you can kind of see the lighter the brush mark is. And this is a really nice tool because I can kind of draw organic strokes as if I were drawing on an actual piece of paper. Now, for those of you who maybe are a little nervous to use a drawing tablet, one of my good hints for you is go ahead and tape a very thin piece of toothy paper, meaning paper with a lot of texture, on your actual tablet. And this way you'll get a little bit of that tactile experience when you're drawing. And one of the things that you can kind of play with as you go forward is you can actually change the different nibs and tips. If you buy one of these tablets and you have a little pen holder, oftentimes those can be unscrewed to secretly, in some cases, reveal a lot of different styles of tips for the top of your brush. So you can see here, I'm just kind of exploring different pressures. So if I really press down on my tablet like I'm doing now, I get a thicker line, but if I just lightly draw, I get a thin tapered line. So this exercise is really about expressiveness in lines and really understanding your kind of feel. Now, one of the suggestions I have, if possible, is don't draw so much with your wrist. You know, draw with your whole arm. You know, if you're kind of in a seated position, think about your drawing classes and think about leading with your elbow, and if you can, lead with your shoulder. Also, hold your pencil in different ways. So if you rotate your grip of your pencil, you can actually get some pretty interesting kind of things. And the coolest part about one of these tablets is if you flip it over, you actually get an eraser, which is pretty darn neat. So let me go over a little bit of the shortcut keys that make the brush tool so good. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer, create a new layer here, layer 1 again, make sure my brush is on black, and I want to teach you some of the shortcut keys you can't live without. So if you look in your keyboard and you find the letter P, P is in person, and go to the right of it, you'll see bracket keys. Those bracket keys actually will make the size of your brush bigger and smaller on the fly. So you can see here I'm moving my bracket keys and now I'm getting a much larger brush, which now you can kind of see some of that painterly feel to that brush itself. Now if I hold Shift and the bracket keys, I'll actually be able to play with the softness. Now this doesn't always work on all brushes. The default soft brush is a really good one to start out with because it's kind of boring, you can see the difference. But if I hold Shift and my bracket key, notice now how that little brush got a lot harder and thicker here. So now we have a little more overlapping. And I suggest for all of you that you kind of play around with the different settings and really use those bracket keys to kind of explore your canvas and explore what you can do. So, you know, really explore the space. And again, if you're just using your mouse, that's okay too. Now, in the brush tool, the bracket keys are not the only cool keys you can use. Your Alt key is a very powerful key. When you hold your Alt key down or your Option key on a Mac, you'll actually get a color picker. And here, you can start picking various colors. So you can see now I have that gray. So if I were using, let's say, red, so I'll click on my red square, and I will scale my brush up, and I'll apply kind of a red color here. And then maybe a blue color beneath that. And I kind of make my own little paint palette, like I'm channeling my inner Bob Ross here. Paint some happy little trees. And when I create my new layer, what I can do is hold that Alt key down, sample a color, and begin to kind of, on the fly, sample these. And what's really neat is this is actually a really great way to start kind of blending and mixing colors. So you can see here I'm kind of getting a purplish color out of these, and I can kind of start blending these other colors. Now, another big mistake people make right off the bat is they paint in full opacity. I highly suggest you paint at a lower opacity. By doing this, you actually can really build up your color. And remember, the more you add to this, the more that you can kind of start blending and mixing and kind of get rid of those kind of harsh lines in your actual piece. So we can do a lot of really cool things, kind of start laying in color. And if you want to change your opacity on the fly, hit your number keys. So if I hit 5 while I'm holding my brush, while I'm just kind of brushing away, it will give me 50%. If I hit 0, it changes it to 100%. If I hit 1, it will change it to 10%. Now, holding Shift and doing those numbers will change your flow of your brush as well. So we can change all these different values with our keyboard and our number palette. So it's kind of a really amazing kind of thing to do as we go forward here. So really kind of cool stuff to kind of go through and really just kind of set the stage for some things. Now, looking into our brushes, it can be pretty overwhelming. So I'm going to go up here into kind of my brush palette, and I just want to show you, these are just some of the default brushes that come with the program. Now, the best way to learn what these do is experiment. You can see here I have dry media brushes, I have wet media brushes, like real oils. Let's go ahead and play with that. You can see with real oil brushes, what I actually can do is pool the paint. I don't know if you all can notice that, and it's not just my computer, it's not lagging here, but it's actually pulling the paint down. And here I can actually turn on settings up the top that really help with the layout. So if I push this button right here, it kind of will pull the paint down. If I push this one right here, it will kind of do some other stuff, and you can go through and play with the different style of brushes that we have, and we can even change the color up in the actual paint palette. So we can lay some color down, we can make our brush wet. Here we go, check that out. Start getting that wet light mix. We can clean our brush, so we reload it. We can take off certain settings, so we have a fresh brush in there, and then start getting some painterly looks. Now, these are really great if you're one who does matte paintings or background paintings for video games, or just would like to kind of get that hand-painted texture like you see in Blizzard games, World of Warcraft, games such as that have that kind of really overly stylized texture. So really understanding and pushing and pulling your paint is pivotal in this matter. And, go ahead and play with all these different settings. You may have ones that you can download from online. You can see this one is kind of really cool. It's almost like a super loaded watercolor brush. And you can see all of them have different settings. We even have a finger paint setting in which it will kind of drag for me. So all of these have really cool things that you can continue to explore and kind of pull your creativity outward there. So really great brushes. Another brush that kind of we can go to, and that's some of these more wet medium brushes, were that mixer brush. So you can see my brush actually changed from the normal brush when I selected that to the mixer brush. And the mixer brush does that. If I were to paint with a regular brush, you can see it doesn't really mix. It just kind of lays down strokes. So all these are really great. These are kind of very non-destructive techniques. I can just delete them, add a new layer, play with some more brushes. I can change my colors on the fly. A little hotkey is Command, Option, and Control. And if you hold Command or Control Option down on a Mac or a PC, you can actually change your color on the fly while you paint. So I can paint with that color, hold those three down, maybe change it a little darker, paint with that. So I can do a lot of really interesting settings here as I go forward. So again, just changing up some of the colors, maybe get some red. Now if you hold Shift, you'll notice it actually locks your orientation of your brush. So be very aware of that as you kind of continue to go. You want to be careful of kind of holding things too far down. So again, really interesting kind of color ability, using these brushes. You can do a lot of crazy things. You can actually change the diameter of your brush by holding the Alt key and the Control key moving it left and right to change the diameter, and up and down to change the softness. So again, Control and Option will do that. Now the ultimate goal, no matter what you do, is to, whether you know all these hotkeys or not, is to one, practice, but know why you're using them. So these lines are only so important. You actually have to be able to lay down specific brush strokes to kind of elicit emotion. So what would a crazy line look like? What color would it be? Would it be jagged? Would it be smooth to jagged? I want you to start thinking about that, because especially in video games such as Borderlands and games of that nature, stylized line really play a huge role in the actual narrative of the story. So that's something I want you to look into. Now, a lot of those games are, like I mentioned, hand painted. So an artist will lay down color and then they'll go over and add brush stroke. And here what they would most likely do is actually use a darker version of the actual color underneath it to lay that out. But on other games, what they use is something called vector. So we're going to kind of minimize our Photoshop and hop over to Photoshop's sister program called Illustrator. Now, Illustrator is a vector program, and people usually love Illustrator and dislike Photoshop, or vice versa. In my mind, Photoshop is like cooking, and Illustrator is more scientific, like baking. But when you master them both, you can really do some amazing things and actually transfer them back and forth between different programs. So I'm going to create a new file. We'll give it a second here. And we can go to print and just create a simple print file here. Double click on that. And in Illustrator, this is referred to as the artboard. We'll have layers. So if your window looks different than mine, go to your Arrange. And we're going to actually just arrange our workspace. So Workspace, Reset Essentials. That will give us kind of the similar background. And you'll notice if you hit B, you have a brush tool. And I want you to, hit your bracket keys. Whoops. If I can find it. I closed down my Illustrator. And that proves to you all that I am not doing any magic behind these videos. So give me a second, I'll reboot it. And what we're going to do is actually go through and draw different types of line in Illustrator. So yes, my computer broke for a second. No, I don't want to send the report. Almost like I knew it was coming. Print. There we go. Letter. There we are. All right, B for brush. And it's going to give me all sorts of cool stuff. So if I start drawing a stroke in here, you can see that my stroke actually it starts off a little more squiggly, or shaky, but as I draw it, when I let go of the brush, it actually gets rather smooth. Well, that's called fidelity. So just like in Photoshop when we dealt with shape, I have a black arrow and a white arrow. And here, the selection tool in Illustrator is V. The direct selection tool, the white arrow, is A. And that allows me to kind of move my anchor points, play with my Bezier handles, much like Photoshop. It allows me to select both of them and hit delete. And we're drawing with stroke here, and you can see my stroke panel on the side of my screen. So if I want to change that fidelity and I double click on my brush, I just double tapped on the brush, I can actually have very accurate fidelity, or I can have very smooth fidelity. And I can change this as I go. And so if I want really smooth lines, if your hand is heavy, heavy and you're still learning, you can see that changes it pretty quickly. And this is usually pretty nice for people who, mainly like myself, I'll be honest with you, who maybe don't draw perfect circles. But with this, you can see the shape is kind of getting refined. And that doesn't mean I can't go in there and kind of do some adjusting and kind of play with some of the anchor points. So be aware that is the case. Now, Illustrator has a really strong brush kind of panel. So as I go forward and we look at some of these brushes and I open these up, at first glance, they're nothing to write home about. But Illustrator is about those hidden menus. So if you see these little lines in the top of the Illustrator menu, you'll see that I actually have brush libraries that have all sorts of brushes, like calligraphy brushes, chalk brushes, and so forth. Well, one of the things I like to do is actually make my own brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my shape tool, much like we did in the shape tutorial in Photoshop. And I'm going to draw my own brush. And I'm going to actually fill this brush. So I'm going to flip my stroke and my fill. And I'm going to use my pen tool. And I'm going to hold down my Option key. And I'm going to make kind of like almost like a weird football shape. And one thing people don't know about Illustrator brushes is you actually can create your own rather easy. So I'm going to open up my Window Brushes panel, and I'll have this kind of sitting here, and I'm going to simply drag this shape into my Brushes panel, and I'm going to create an art brush. Very easy, simple step. And at this point, I'm going to leave everything as is and hit OK. And then I can even delete that. But now, check this out. I have this custom brush that is a cool art line. And, you know, I can change the kind of scale of that brush to get thinner strokes. And I can recreate some really, really amazing kind of tapered lines, and that's off the stroke. And what makes this even cooler is I can actually take that brush and drag it back out, and get this, I can actually edit that shape further to make a brand new brush. So if I wanted to make more of a round brush and take that brush and drag it back in, I could go through the whole process again of making that brush. So we'll do that. I'll highlight all these and hit delete. B for brush. Let's set our stroke to small. And now I have a more rounded edge brush. Or I could go back to the tapered brush, as you can see the difference. So Illustrator is a super powerful tool. For those of you wanting to do mobile games, this is really where it's at. So a lot of game characters are built off of shapes and lines in Illustrator. And remember, as you do that, use your layers. So you're going to have a layer just of strokes. So I know a lot of artists that will actually put in their shapes first. And they'll kind of manipulate those shapes, you know, get the basic outline of a shape. So if they're doing like some sort of like angry bird, and then they'll go through and draw their stroke separately around that. And it becomes really, really easy at that point. Now, when you all draw your strokes, you want to maybe one day scale them. So one of my suggestions is, if you're drawing strokes in Illustrator and you get the stroke you like, so let's do a kind of a zigzag one here. When you're done with it and you scale, you can see the stroke scales with it. When you're ready to go, you can also do something called a expand appearance. And what this will do is actually make that stroke into its own shape. So I want to show you this in a little more detail. So this is the stroke I just drew, and I'm going to duplicate it by holding the Alt key and dragging a new one down. And I'm going to expand the appearance of one of them and get my white arrow, and you'll see all these little dots. So what I've done, let's grab them both, is by expanding the appearance, I've actually made a shape out of it. So I'm turning my line art into shapes. And as I mentioned, these are really easy to kind of work with, and especially bring into Photoshop. Check this out. I can simply File, Copy, go to my Photoshop. Let's open a new file real quick. And we'll do that. Zoom in a little bit, File, Paste, Smart Object. So again, I just did Edit, Paste, Smart Object, and check this out. When I hit Enter, I have my stroke. And what makes this even cooler is I can double click on this and it will open back up a file in Illustrator in which I can actually edit. And this is called a Smart Object. This is a really cool way to kind of edit your lines. And when I save this and go back to Photoshop, check that out. And now I have a scalable stroke within Photoshop at whatever resolution. Now right now I'm at 100, so you can see it's clear. Now no matter what I do, if I'm 1600% zoomed in, it's going to look pixelated. So just keep that in mind. But overall, you can see I can go back and forth from Illustrator to Photoshop rather easy. So what your assignment is in this one is I want you to kind of look at the examples I provided. And I gave you a bullet point list of different emotions that I want you to try to convey using just stroke. So you can do these in Illustrator, you can do these in Photoshop, you can copy and paste them, whatever you'd like. But what would an angry line look like? What would a peaceful line look like, right? Would it be very soft, tapered? Would an angry line look like more aggressive, like this? What would a, passive line look like? What would a, anxious line look like? Now, I want you to go through that bullet point and do that. I also want you to explore different pen tools and different options and, explore elements like cross-hatching, right? How would you achieve that within your tool? And you can, like I said, you can use Photoshop, Illustrator. If you find something you like, kind of go with that. Now, what I would suggest in the end is kind of using Photoshop as your home base. So if you would like, you can set this up by creating a new document. Give it a few seconds here. And we'll go to Photo, and let's see. We will use a 8x10 portrait. And we'll put the resolution down to 72 to keep the file size small. And what you can do is actually kind of draw your different lines. Now, for those of you in the class, I want you to make sure you label them very nicely. So I could use my text tool, and I could simply say, like, crazy line or crazy. I'm an art teacher, not a spelling teacher. So if I do a crazy line here, and I get my brush, and I look through all my brushes, and I find one that maybe to me will help me get that kind of wild, crazy type of line, maybe this brush right here, I make a new layer, and then maybe scale my brush down, and just draw your crazy line. That's it. So that one's done. And then you would just do the same thing. You would go to the next one, type the letter, or type the word that it defines it, draw it out. So organize this as best as you possibly can, but when you're done, you should have kind of a list of different techniques and styles. Now, I made mine very big for the demo's sake, but you're going to want to maximize your space. And when you're completely done drawing these out, File, Save As, Desktop, Format, we'll make it a JPEG again, and go ahead and save that as your JPEG. And make sure you name it something in which you can find it. You just hit OK, you'll save that out and go from there. So you can have all these different types of lines. So make sure you read your directions carefully. But in the end, I hope you know how to kind of utilize different brushes, different strokes, and don't be afraid. If those of you who know a little more about Photoshop, feel free to download brushes. Feel free to change the color of your brushes. It doesn't always have to be just one color. If it's a passionate brush, maybe you make it a bright red. Or if it's a shy brush, maybe you make it, a little bit more of a kind of a grayish color. If it's a lively brush, maybe it's green for vivid and lively. So I really want you to explore these colors, these brushes, and then more importantly, the scale and size of your brush stroke. No two marks should really look the same for these kind of emotional marks. The choice is yours on how you do it. Just make sure you clearly label it. And good luck with the exercise. I can't wait to see what you guys do.